The whisper of hunger. Jonah's day began long before the sun rose, its faint promise of light obscured by the heavy clouds that always seemed to linger over the slums. The small shack she and her son, Tavi, called home was little more than a hodgepodge of scrap metal and wood barely holding together against the elements. Inside, the air was damp and stale, and every creak of the wind rattled their fragile walls, as if reminding them of how precarious their lives were. She crouched on the cold, uneven floor, scrubbing clothes with a determination that belied her weariness. Each item of clothing was soaked in soap and water that numbed her fingers, the rhythmic motion her only distraction from the gnawing hunger in her stomach. Her employer's meager payment barely covered their needs, and the weight of each day's survival fell squarely on her shoulders. Davy stirred in the corner, his frail form wrapped in a threadbare blanket. At 8 years old, he was wise beyond his years, his innocence worn thin by hardship. He woke to the now familiar pangs of hunger that greeted him every morning, a companion he had learned to endure. He rubbed his eyes and approached his mother, whose head was bowed over her task. "Mom," he murmured softly, tugging at her sleeve. "Do we have anything to eat today?" Jonah's hand froze mid-scrub. She didn't look up immediately, her mind scrambling for an answer that wouldn't reveal the harsh truth. She finally turned to him, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll manage, my love," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "We always do." Davy nodded, his eyes searching her face for reassurance. Her words rang hollow, though, and he could hear the silence of the cupboards, feel the emptiness that had become a part of their lives. He wanted to believe her, but belief was a fragile thing when hunger was a constant companion. Later, as Jonah hung the freshly washed clothes on a sagging clothesline outside, her neighbor Marta approached. Marta was a stout woman with a sharp tongue but a soft heart, and Jonah often found her company a small comfort in this unforgiving world. "Jonah," Marta called out, her tone unusually somber, "I have some bad news." Jonah turned, her hands dripping with soapy water. The look on Marta's face made her chest tighten. "What is it?" Jonah asked, bracing herself. "It's about the lady you work for," Marta said, her voice low. "She's found someone else, someone who works cheaper." "I'm sorry, Jonah. Times are hard for everyone." Jonah stared at her, the words hitting her like a blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Marta placed a hand on her arm, gave it a squeeze, and walked away, leaving Jonah standing there, numb. Her job, meager as it was, had been their lifeline. Without it, she didn't know how they would survive. Inside the shack, Davy watched her from the window. He saw the way her shoulders sagged, the way she seemed smaller somehow. He hated seeing her like that, hated the helplessness that churned in his chest. When she came inside, he ran to her, clutching her sleeve. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jonah knelt down, placing her hands on his thin shoulders. She looked into his wide, worried eyes and smiled, though it felt like her heart was breaking. "We'll be fine, Davy," she said softly. "We always manage, don't we?" He nodded, though his stomach churned with unease. The words sounded familiar, but they didn't feel true. He knew there was nothing left in the cupboards, had seen the emptiness for himself. That evening, as the gray sky darkened, the narrow street outside their shack grew quieter. Jonah sat with Davy, sharing the last piece of bread they had. It was stale and small, barely enough for one person, but they made it last, chewing slowly. Davy broke his piece in half and offered it to his mother. "No, Mom, you eat too," he said firmly. Jonah hesitated but accepted, her chest aching with love and sorrow. She kissed the top of his head, tears pricking her eyes. Suddenly, they heard footsteps outside. Davy looked up, his curiosity piqued. Through the small broken window, he saw a man walking down the street. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. He seemed out of place in this part of town, where poverty clung to every corner like a shadow. "Mom," Davy whispered, his voice breaking. Are we really not going to have anything tomorrow? Jonah froze. She looked down at him, her lips pressed tightly together. She couldn't lie to him. Not this time. She shook her head slowly. No, Davy, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Not tomorrow. The man in the suit stopped. He turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the scene in front of the shack. He saw the boy, his face thin, his eyes wide with despair. He saw the mother, her shoulders slumped, her expression tired and resigned. Something in him shifted, a pang of discomfort he couldn't ignore. He approached them cautiously, his footsteps tentative. Davy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. Jonah stood, her posture straightening, her gaze wary. Excuse me, the man said, his voice hesitant. I couldn't help but notice. Do you need help? Jonah's jaw tightened. She didn't want pity, didn't want to be a charity case. She shook her head firmly, her voice cold. We're fine, she said. Thank you. The man hesitated, his gaze shifting to Davy. He could see the boy's ribs through his shirt, the hollowness in his cheeks. His heart sank. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, holding out some bills. Please, he said gently, let me help. Jonah's eyes flicked to the money, then back to the man. Her pride flared up, hot and sharp. No, she said, stepping back. We don't take handouts. The man looked surprised. He nodded slowly, his hand dropping to his side. He slipped the money back into his pocket and looked at Davy one last time before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Davy watched him go, confusion and disappointment swirling in his chest. He didn't understand why his mother had refused the money. They needed it, didn't they? But when he looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes, he didn't say anything. He leaned into her, resting his head against her side. We'll be fine, Davy, Jonah whispered, kissing the top of his head. We always manage. But as she stared out into the dim street, watching the man's figure disappear into the night, she felt a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't shake. She didn't know how they would manage this time, and the thought terrified her. A stranger's burden. The man in the suit walked away, his polished shoes tapping against the uneven pavement, each step echoing louder in his mind than it did on the street. His name was Antonio Guerra, a self-made millionaire whose rise to success had been paved by relentless work, sharp business acumen, and, admittedly, a lack of consideration for anything outside his sphere of influence. He was known as a man of precision and calculation, someone who rarely let emotion sway his decisions. But something about the scene he had just witnessed lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the woman's firm refusal of his money or the haunted look in her eyes. It was the boy. The boy's gaze, wide and hollow, was an image Antonio couldn't seem to shake. He had seen hunger before, in documentaries in distant lands during his travels, but he had never seen it this close, had never felt it clawing at the edges of his world. Antonio stopped at the corner of the street, his breath visible in the cool evening air. He glanced back over his shoulder at the shack, barely distinguishable in the dim light. He had been on his way to a dinner meeting, an affair meant to seal a lucrative deal that would expand his company's reach. Yet now, the thought of sitting at a table laden with food and wine while that boy went hungry made his stomach churn. He adjusted the strap of his briefcase and sighed. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself. Jonah sat by the faint glow of a candle, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as Davy slept on the thin mattress beside her. His small body rose and fell with shallow breaths, his exhaustion outweighing his hunger for the moment. The basket of clean clothes sat by the door, a cruel reminder of the job she no longer had. She couldn't stop thinking about the man, his crisp suit, his polished shoes, the money he had offered. Why had he stopped? Men like him didn't come to places like this unless they were lost or looking for something specific. His offer of help had been genuine. She was sure of that, but her pride had flared up like a protective shield. She wasn't some beggar on the street, waiting for scraps from the tables of the rich. She was a mother, a worker, someone trying to provide for her son with dignity. But dignity, she realized bitterly, didn't fill empty stomachs. She looked down at Davy, her heart aching at the sight of his thin frame. His refusal to eat the entire piece of bread earlier had touched her deeply, but it had also filled her with guilt. She was his mother. She was supposed to provide for him, not share in his deprivation. The sound of footsteps outside startled her, and she stiffened, her hand instinctively moving to the rusted pan she kept near the door. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. A soft knock followed, hesitant yet deliberate. She held her breath, her heart racing. "Mrs. Joanna," a voice called softly. Her brow furrowed. She recognized the voice but couldn't place it immediately. Slowly, she moved to the door and peered through a crack. To her surprise, it was the man in the suit. She opened the door just a fraction, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low. Antonio stood there, his briefcase in one hand and a small bag in the other. He looked at her, his usually confident demeanor subdued. "I know you said you didn't need help," he began, his tone careful, "but I couldn't walk away. I thought about your son, about you, and I brought this." He held out the bag. Joanna glanced at it warily. "What is it?" "Food," he said simply. "Just some bread, rice, and a few other things. Nothing extravagant." Her grip on the door tightened. "I told you, we don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," Antonio said quickly, stepping back slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill. You can do what you want with it. Keep it, share it, throw it away. But I couldn't leave knowing that boy might go to bed hungry." Joanna's resolve faltered as she looked at the bag. The scent of fresh bread wafted faintly toward her, and her stomach twisted in response. She glanced back at Davy, still asleep on the mattress, and then at Antonio. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice softer now. "Why are you doing this?" Antonio hesitated. He didn't have an easy answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said at last. "And because I can." Joanna's lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, she opened the door wider and took the bag from him. "Thank you," she said grudgingly, her eyes avoiding his. Antonio gave a small nod. "I won't bother you again," he said, sensing her discomfort. "But if you ever need anything." She cut him off with a curt nod. "Good night, Mr. Guerra," he supplied. "Antonio Guerra." "Good night, Mr. Guerra," she said, her tone final as she closed the door. Antonio stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment, only a deep unease. He turned and walked away, the weight of the night pressing heavily on him. The next morning, Joanna woke to the sound of Davy's voice, bright and filled with excitement. "Mom, look, there's rice and bread." She sat up, momentarily disoriented, and saw Davy kneeling by the bag Antonio had brought. He held up a loaf of bread as if it were a treasure, his eyes shining with joy. Joanna's throat tightened. "Put that down, Davy," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "We'll eat later." Davy frowned, but he set the bread down carefully. "Did that man bring it, Mom? The one in the suit?" Joanna hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but we don't rely on people like him, Davy. Remember that." "Why not?" he asked, his innocence cutting through her defenses. "He seemed nice." She sighed, pulling him close. "Because nice isn't enough, my love. We have to take care of ourselves." But as she held him, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe, just maybe, the man's intentions were genuine. But trusting people had never been a luxury she could afford. Across town, Antonio sat in his expansive office, staring out at the city skyline. The polished glass walls reflected his success, but he felt disconnected from it all. His assistant, Laura, entered with a stack of papers and a puzzled look on her face. "Sir, you canceled the meeting with the investors. Is everything all right?" Antonio turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Laura, do you ever think about the people we affect? The ones who live in the buildings we buy, the ones displaced by our projects?" Laura blinked, caught off guard. "Well, sir, it's business. We can't think about every individual. If we did, we wouldn't get anything done." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Maybe that's the problem." Laura hesitated, then placed the papers on his desk. "If you need anything, just let me know." As she left, Antonio leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying the scene outside the shack. He realized that he had been looking at life from the top down for too long. It was time to see things from the ground up. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Cancel all my appointments for the week. I need to take care of something." Antonio Guerra was a man of action, and this time his actions were going to change lives, including his own. The ripple of a decision. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and the hum of conversation filled the sleek, modern space. Antonio Guerra, however, was oblivious to the bustle. He sat at his desk, his gaze fixed on the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. His thoughts were elsewhere, far from the boardrooms and skyscrapers that had defined his life. The images of Joanna and Davi haunted him. The boy's hollow cheeks, the woman's fierce pride masking her despair. For years, Antonio had been a man of numbers, contracts, and growth projections. He measured success in profits and expansions. But now, for the first time, he was questioning what it all meant. What good was wealth if it didn't create something meaningful? He stood abruptly, startling Laura, who had just entered the room with a tablet in hand. She froze, blinking in surprise. "Sir, is something wrong?" Antonio shook his head, though his expression was tight. "Cancel the investor luncheon," he said briskly, "and clear my schedule for the day." Laura hesitated. "The board has been asking about the upcoming project in the South District. They're expecting an update." "They'll wait," Antonio interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He grabbed his coat and briefcase, heading for the door. "I have more important things to handle." Jonah spent the morning meticulously rationing the contents of the bag Antonio had brought. The small loaf of bread, the bag of rice, and the canned goods were meager, but to her, they represented a reprieve. She prepared a modest meal of rice and beans, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred the pot over their makeshift stove. The aroma filled the tiny shack, and Davy's face lit up with anticipation. "Mom, it smells so good," he exclaimed, peeking over her shoulder. Jonah smiled faintly, her heart swelling at his excitement. "It's nothing fancy, but it'll fill our bellies," she said, scooping the steaming food onto 2 plates. They sat on the floor, their mismatched plates balanced on an upturned crate that served as a table. Davy ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Jonah watched him, her own portion untouched. "Mom, aren't you hungry?" he asked, pausing mid-bite. Jonah forced a smile. "I'm fine, Davy. Eat up." He frowned but didn't argue. After they finished, Jonah cleaned up quickly and busied herself with small tasks around the shack. She hated the stillness of the afternoon, the way it gave her too much time to think. The uncertainty of their future loomed over her like a storm cloud. As she hung laundry on the line outside, a shadow fell across her. She turned, startled, to see Antonio standing a few feet away. He was dressed more casually this time, his suit jacket replaced by a simple button-up shirt and slacks. His expression was earnest, almost apologetic. "What are you doing here?" Jonah demanded, her tone sharp. Antonio raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. I wanted to talk." Jonah folded her arms, her gaze wary. "We don't need anything from you. I already took the food. That's enough." "It's not enough," Antonio said quietly, stepping closer. "Not for me." Jonah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Antonio hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about you and Davi, about the way you live, the challenges you face. It's not right. And I can't just walk away and pretend I didn't see it." Jonah's lips tightened. "What do you want from us, Mr. Guerra? Charity isn't going to fix our lives." Antonio shook his head. "I don't want to give you charity, Jonah. I want to give you a chance. A real one." Her arms dropped to her sides, and for the first time, her expression softened slightly. "What kind of chance?" That evening, Antonio returned to his office with a renewed sense of purpose. He summoned Laura and his core team to the conference room, where they sat around the long, polished table. The atmosphere was tense. They could tell something was different. "Thank you for coming," Antonio began, his voice steady but resolute. "I've made a decision that will affect our operations moving forward." The team exchanged puzzled glances. Gustavo, his operations manager, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Sir, if this is about the South District project—" "This isn't about the South District," Antonio interrupted, his tone firm. "This is about the communities we're impacting with our work, the people who live in the buildings we acquire, the families who are being displaced." The room fell silent. Laura's pen hovered over her notepad, and Gustavo frowned, clearly unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I met a family yesterday," Antonio continued, his gaze sweeping the table. "A mother and her son, living in conditions that no one should have to endure. They're not the only ones. There are countless others like them. And we've been part of the problem." Gustavo cleared his throat. "With all due respect, sir, we're running a business. We can't save everyone." "I'm not asking to save everyone," Antonio said sharply. "I'm asking us to do better, to find a way to balance profit with compassion. Starting today, we're suspending all evictions in the South District, and I want a team dedicated to finding solutions, job programs, affordable housing options, partnerships with local organizations." The room erupted into murmurs of dissent. Laura raised a tentative hand. "Sir, this is a significant shift. The board might not approve." Antonio's jaw tightened. "Let me worry about the board." Gustavo shook his head. "This could hurt our bottom line." Investors can wait," Antonio snapped, his voice cutting through the noise. "I built this company from nothing, and I'll rebuild it if I have to. But I won't continue to profit off the suffering of others." The team stared at him, stunned. For years, Antonio had been the epitome of a ruthless businessman, someone who valued results above all else. This version of him was almost unrecognizable. Over the next few days, Antonio's office became a flurry of activity. He personally visited the South District, speaking with families, community leaders, and social workers. He arranged for repairs to be made to dilapidated buildings, hired local contractors to provide jobs, and established a fund for emergency relief. Word spread quickly about the wealthy man who had come to the slums not with promises, but with action. Jonna heard the whispers from her neighbors, their voices tinged with a mix of skepticism and hope. One afternoon, as she sat outside her shack mending clothes, Antonio appeared again. This time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a woman with a clipboard and a friendly smile. "Jonna," Antonio said, stopping a few steps away. "This is Rosa. She runs a local job placement agency." Jonna stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "What does that have to do with me?" Rosa stepped forward. "Mr. Guerra told me about your situation. I've got a few openings that might interest you. Laundry services, seamstress work. The pay isn't much, but it's steady." Jonna blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "You're serious?" "Very," Rosa said with a smile. "If you're interested, I can help you get started." Jonna looked at Antonio, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was determination. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Antonio met her gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because everyone deserves a chance." For the first time in years, Jonna felt something unfamiliar stir within her. Hope. She nodded slowly. All right, let's talk. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the narrow streets, Antonio watched Joanna and Rosa discuss the possibilities ahead. He felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. This was just the beginning, but for the first time, he knew he was on the right path. The seeds of change. Antonio Guerra stood at the edge of the South District Community Center, a newly rented space that had once been an abandoned building. Its peeling paint and cracked windows had been transformed into something vibrant. Bright murals painted by local artists adorned the walls, depicting scenes of hope and resilience. Inside, children laughed and played, their voices echoing through the air like a melody Antonio hadn't realized he needed to hear. The change was slow but tangible. Over the weeks since Antonio's decision to pause evictions and reinvest in the community, the neighborhood had begun to breathe again. The first step had been securing basic resources: food, clean water, and healthcare. Antonio had partnered with local organizations to provide free clinics and meal distributions, drawing skeptical but grateful residents to the center. But the deeper, more impactful change came with the creation of opportunities. Job training programs, educational workshops, and microloans for small businesses were introduced. Antonio insisted these programs focus on sustainability, empowering residents rather than fostering dependency. Joanna was one of the first to benefit. Joanna sat in a circle of women at the community center, her hands deftly stitching fabric, as Rosa led a workshop on tailoring and clothing repair. The room was filled with the hum of sewing machines and the quiet murmur of conversation. It had been years since Joanna had felt part of something larger than her daily struggle for survival. Rosa walked over, her clipboard in hand. "Joanna, I've got good news," she said with a smile. "There's a tailor in town looking for someone to help with alterations. I told him about your skills, and he's willing to give you a trial." Joanna's needle paused mid-stitch, her heart skipping a beat. "A trial?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," Rosa replied. "It's part-time to start, but if it goes well, it could turn into something steady." Joanna's first instinct was doubt. Opportunities like this rarely came without strings attached. But then she thought of Davy, of the small but growing light in his eyes since the day Antonio brought food to their door. This was her chance to build something for him. Something real. "I'll do it," Joanna said firmly, a spark of determination in her voice. "When do I start?" Davy, meanwhile, was flourishing in ways Joanna hadn't anticipated. With Antonio's encouragement, the community center had set up an art corner for the children, stocked with pencils, crayons, and paper. Davy spent hours there, sketching everything from the stray dogs that roamed the streets to the vibrant murals on the walls. One afternoon, Antonio stopped by the art corner, curious to see the children's creations. He found Davy hunched over a piece of paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. The boy looked up as Antonio approached, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Antonio," Davy exclaimed, holding up his drawing. "Look, it's you." Antonio chuckled as he examined the picture. It was a surprisingly accurate rendering of himself, standing in front of the community center with a briefcase in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. "This is amazing, Davy," Antonio said sincerely. "You've got real talent." Davy beamed, his cheeks flushing with pride. "Do you think I could be an artist someday?" Antonio crouched down, meeting the boy's eager gaze. "Not someday, Davy. You're already an artist, and with a little help, you could become anything you want." Davy's smile faltered slightly. "But we don't have money for art school. Mom says we have to save every penny." Antonio placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry about that. We'll figure it out. Just keep drawing, okay?" Davy nodded, clutching his pencil like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Okay, Mr. Antonio." Despite the progress, not everyone welcomed Antonio's efforts. Gustavo and the company's board of directors were growing increasingly restless. They viewed Antonio's initiatives as a distraction from the company's primary goal: profit. One afternoon, Antonio found himself seated at the head of the boardroom table, facing a panel of stern-faced executives. Gustavo, as usual, took the lead in voicing their concerns. "Mr. Guerra," Gustavo began, his tone clipped, "we respect your vision, but the investors are growing impatient. The South District project is stalled, and they're demanding answers." Antonio leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "The South District project will proceed when it's ready. I won't push forward at the expense of the community." "With all due respect," Gustavo countered, "our responsibility is to the shareholders. These humanitarian efforts, while noble, are not sustainable. They're draining resources that could be better utilized elsewhere." Antonio's gaze hardened. "Our responsibility is to more than just shareholders, Gustavo. It's to the people who live in the buildings we buy, the families we displace. If we can't balance profit with compassion, then we failed as a company." The room fell silent. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unaccustomed to hearing such words from their usually pragmatic leader. "I'm not asking for your approval," Antonio continued, his voice steady but resolute. "This is my decision, and it's final. If the investors have an issue, they can speak to me directly." Gustavo opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. He nodded reluctantly, and the meeting adjourned. That evening, Antonio returned to the community center, seeking solace in the energy and warmth of the place. He wandered into the art corner, where Davi was proudly showing his latest drawing to a small group of children. Jonna stood nearby, watching her son with a mixture of pride and gratitude. She noticed Antonio and walked over, her expression softer than usual. "You've done a lot for us," she said quietly. "For this whole neighborhood." Antonio shook his head. "It's not enough." "It's more than anyone else has done," Jonah replied. "And it's more than we ever expected." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching Davi laugh with the other children. Jonah glanced at Antonio, her voice hesitant. "Why are you doing all this? Really?" Antonio hesitated, searching for the right words. "I spent years building my company, chasing success, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. Meeting you and Davi, it reminded me of the responsibility that comes with what I have. I can't change the past, but I can try to do better now." Johanna studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "You're a strange man, Mr. Guerra." Antonio chuckled. "I've been called worse." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the community center, Antonio felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The seeds of change had been planted, and while there was still much work to be done, he was ready for the journey ahead. For the first time in his life, Antonio Guerra wasn't chasing wealth. He was building something far more valuable. And it all started with a boy, his mother, and the courage to care. The fight for tomorrow. Antonio Guerra sat at his desk, the skyline of the city spread out before him, glittering like the promise of prosperity he had once chased relentlessly. Papers were strewn across the polished mahogany surface, plans for the South District Community Redevelopment Project, financial reports, and lists of families still in need. It was overwhelming, but Antonio felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The transformation of the South District had gained attention, both positive and critical. News outlets were calling it Guerra's Gamble, praising his unconventional approach to corporate responsibility, while skeptics labeled it a costly distraction. His board remained tense, worried about profit margins, but Antonio was unyielding. This wasn't just about charity. It was about reshaping the foundation of his company, and by extension, his own legacy. Meanwhile, in the heart of the South District, Jonna's life had shifted dramatically. Her part-time trial at the tailor's shop had turned into a steady job. Her hands, once raw from scrubbing clothes for pennies, now worked skillfully with fabric and thread, creating garments that brought in a fair wage. The weight of uncertainty that had pressed on her for so long began to lift. though her cautious nature kept her from fully relaxing. Davy, too, was thriving. The community center had become his sanctuary, a place where he could dream freely with a pencil in hand. His sketches, once crude and hurried, had evolved into detailed works of art that captured the vibrancy and resilience of the South District. Rosa, the community center coordinator, had even displayed some of his pieces in the main hall, earning him shy praise from neighbors. One afternoon, as Jonna returned home from work, she found Davy waiting for her outside their shack, clutching a folded piece of paper. His face was alight with excitement. "Mom," he called, running to her. "Look at this." Jonna knelt, taking the paper from him. It was a flyer for an art competition at the community center, open to children across the city. The winner would receive a scholarship to a prestigious art school. Jonna's heart sank slightly as she read the details. The entry fee, while modest, was more than they could afford without sacrificing other necessities. "Davy," she began gently, "this is wonderful, but I'm not sure we can." "Mr. Antonio said he'd help," Davy interrupted, his eyes wide and hopeful. "He said I should enter." Jonna's lips pressed into a thin line. She was grateful for Antonio's support, but the idea of depending on him for something as significant as this made her uneasy. She didn't want to owe anyone more than she already did. "We'll see," she said finally, rising to her feet. "Let's talk about it later." Davy nodded, though his disappointment was evident. That evening, Antonio visited the community center as he often did. He found Jonna helping Rosa organize supplies for an upcoming workshop. When she saw him, she hesitated, then approached. "Mr. Guerra," she began, her tone measured, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us, truly. But I need to ask, why are you encouraging Davy to enter that art competition?" Antonio smiled, sensing the tension in her voice. "Because he's talented," he said simply. "And because he deserves a chance to show what he can do." Jonna frowned. "But what if he doesn't win? What if he gets his hopes up and—" "Jonna," Antonio interrupted gently, "what if he does win? What if this is the opportunity that changes his life? Shouldn't he have the chance to try?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I just don't want him to be disappointed." "Disappointment is part of life," Antonio said, "but so is hope. And I think Davy has plenty of that, thanks to you." Jonna looked at him, her defenses softening. "The entry fee." "I'll cover it," Antonio said before she could finish. "Consider it an investment in Davy and in this community." For once, Jonna didn't argue. She nodded, her gratitude unspoken but evident in her eyes. The weeks leading up to the competition were a whirlwind for Davy. He spent every spare moment at the art corner, sketching and revising his entry with the guidance of local artists Antonio had invited to the community center. His chosen subject was a scene close to his heart, a depiction of life in the South District, with its struggles and triumphs rendered in vibrant colors. Antonio visited often, offering encouragement and occasionally sitting with Davy as he worked. Their bond grew stronger, a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. "Why do you care so much about me, Mr. Antonio?" Davy asked one afternoon. His pencil paused mid-stroke. Antonio thought for a moment before answering. "Because you remind me of myself when I was your age. I didn't have much either, but someone gave me a chance. I'm just paying it forward." Davy nodded thoughtfully. "When I grow up, I want to help people too." Antonio smiled. "I have no doubt you will." The day of the competition arrived, bringing a mix of excitement and nerves. The community center was abuzz with activity as families from across the city arrived to support the young artists. Davy's entry, titled "A Thousand Hopes," was displayed prominently, its bold colors and intricate details drawing admiration from visitors. Jonna stood by Davy's side, her hand on his shoulder. She wore her best dress, a simple but elegant piece she had mended herself. Antonio arrived shortly after, blending into the crowd with a casual outfit that belied his usual polished appearance. As the judges deliberated, Antonio pulled Jonah aside. No matter the outcome, Davy has already won, he said. Look around. This is his work being celebrated. Jonah glanced at the crowd surrounding Davy's piece, their admiration evident. Her heart swelled with pride. I never thought we'd see something like this, she admitted. It feels unreal. It's real, Antonio said firmly. And it's only the beginning. When the results were finally announced, Davy's name was called as the winner. Jonah let out an audible gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Davy stood frozen for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. He ran to Jonah, throwing his arms around her. We did it, Mom, he exclaimed. Jonah held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. No, Davy, you did it. Antonio watched from a distance, his own emotions bubbling beneath the surface. For all his wealth and accomplishments, this moment felt like his greatest achievement. As the evening wound down and the crowd dispersed, Antonio approached Jonah and Davy one last time. What's next for you, Davy? He asked, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. I'm going to art school, Davy said, his voice brimming with excitement. Antonio smiled. And after that? Davy thought for a moment. After that, I'm going to paint the world. Antonio laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. I believe you will. As Antonio walked away, Jonah called after him. Mr. Guerra. He turned, raising an eyebrow. Yes? Her expression was soft, her voice full of emotion. Thank you. For everything. Antonio nodded. Don't thank me, Jonah. Just keep moving forward. The South District still had a long way to go, but Antonio knew they were building something lasting. It wasn't just about money or influence anymore. It was about people, about hope, about making a difference. And for the first time in his life, Antonio Guerra felt truly wealthy. Building bridges, changing lives. The months that followed the art competition were transformative for the South District and everyone involved in Antonio Guerra's initiative. What had begun as a personal quest to make amends had blossomed into a community-wide movement. Antonio's actions had inspired not only the residents of the South District, but also others across the city. Change, once a faint whisper, had grown into a resounding call. Jonah's rising confidence. Jonah's life had settled into a new rhythm, one defined by work, stability, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her job at the tailor's shop had evolved from simple alterations to creating custom pieces. Her boss had noticed her meticulous attention to detail and had given her more responsibility, which brought an increase in pay. With every stitch, Jonah felt herself stitching together the fragments of her life that hardship had torn apart. On weekends, she began volunteering at the community center, teaching sewing classes to women who wanted to learn a skill that could help them earn an income. The shy, withdrawn Jonah who had once avoided eye contact with strangers had been replaced by a woman with steady confidence. One afternoon, Rosa approached Jonah after a workshop. You've become one of our greatest assets, Jonah, she said warmly. The women here look up to you. Jonah smiled, her hands resting on her sewing machine. I'm just giving back what I've been given. Sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do, Rosa replied. Jonah glanced across the room at Davy, who was busy helping younger children at the art corner. She couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. And though she still carried the scars of their struggles, they no longer defined her. They had become reminders of her strength. Davy's bright future. Davy's scholarship to the art school had opened doors neither he nor Jonah had dared to dream of. Each morning, he traveled to the city's prestigious Academy of Visual Arts, where he was surrounded by peers and mentors who nurtured his talent. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. The Academy's vibrant environment challenged him to grow. He learned techniques he had only seen in books and began experimenting with new styles. But Davy never forgot his roots. His pieces often reflected life in the South District, capturing the vibrancy and resilience of his community. One of his paintings, A Mother's Hands, was selected for an exhibition at the city's main gallery. It depicted Jonah's hands, worn but strong, stitching fabric under the warm glow of a single candle. Critics praised it for its raw emotion and depth, but for Davy, it was a simple tribute to the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. On the night of the exhibition, Antonio stood beside Joanna as they admired Davy's work. Joanna's eyes glistened with pride as she whispered, "He's going to do great things." Antonio smiled. "He already is." Antonio's transformation. For Antonio, the South District Initiative had become a cornerstone of his life and his company. What began as a personal mission had evolved into a corporate philosophy. He restructured his business to include a division dedicated to community development, staffed by individuals who shared his vision for balancing profit with purpose. The board had been hesitant at first, but the success of the South District project had silenced many critics. Investors who initially doubted Antonio's direction had come to see the value in his approach. The company's public image had transformed, earning widespread respect for its commitment to social responsibility. But for Antonio, the real reward wasn't in the accolades or financial gains. It was in the faces of the people he had come to know. The children laughing at the community center, the women finding empowerment through new skills, and the families who no longer lived in fear of eviction. One day, as Antonio walked through the South District, he was approached by an elderly man sitting outside his modest home. The man gestured for Antonio to join him. "You've done something remarkable here," the man said, his voice rough but kind. "But it's not just about the buildings or the programs. You gave people hope. That's something money can't buy." Antonio nodded, humbled. "I didn't do it alone. The people here, they're the ones who made it possible." The man chuckled. "True, but you gave them the chance. Don't underestimate that." As Antonio walked away, he realized how much he had learned from the South District. It wasn't just about giving. It was about listening, understanding, and building trust. A new beginning. The South District continued to flourish. Streets once marked by neglect were now lined with colorful murals painted by Davy and other local artists. Small businesses sprang up, supported by microloans from Antonio's company. The community center expanded its programs, offering everything from vocational training to after-school tutoring. One evening, the community gathered for a celebration. Tables were set up along the main street, adorned with food and decorations. Music played, children danced, and laughter filled the air. It was a moment of pure joy, a testament to the resilience and strength of the South District. Joanna stood with Davy at her side, both of them beaming. Antonio arrived late, greeted by cheers and applause. He waved it off with a smile, but Joanna caught his arm as he approached. "You've done more than we ever could have imagined," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Antonio looked at her, his expression earnest. "Thank you, Joanna, for trusting me." As the celebration continued into the night, Antonio found himself sitting with Davy, watching the boy sketch a lively scene of the festivities. Antonio leaned back, content, as the sounds of laughter and music surrounded him. The South District was no longer just a project or a responsibility. It was a part of his life, his family. And in helping to rebuild this community, Antonio Guerra had found something he hadn't realized he was missing: a purpose greater than himself. The legacy he was building wasn't measured in profits or skyscrapers, but in lives changed, bridges built, and the enduring power of hope. Legacies of hope. The South District had transformed into a beacon of possibility. What had once been a dilapidated and forgotten area was now a thriving community, its streets bustling with life. Antonio Guerra had not just altered the physical landscape but had sparked a cultural and emotional renaissance. His efforts had rippled outward, inspiring other business leaders and philanthropists to rethink their approach to corporate responsibility. But the work was far from over. Joanna's growing impact. Joanna had evolved into a leader within the community, though she never sought the role. Her sewing classes had grown beyond the community center, turning into a cooperative where women could pool their skills to fulfill larger orders from local businesses. The cooperative provided a steady income for its members, giving them the financial independence they had long been denied. One afternoon, as Jonah sat at her sewing machine surrounded by other women, Rosa approached her with an idea. "Jonah," Rosa said, pulling up a chair, "we've been talking about expanding the cooperative." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "Expanding how?" "There's a grant program for small businesses in underserved areas," Rosa explained. "If we apply and get it, we could open a proper workshop, maybe even start selling our products online." Jonah hesitated. The thought of growth excited her, but it also scared her. "That sounds ambitious." "It is," Rosa admitted, "but if anyone can make it work, it's you. You've already changed so much for the women here." Jonah glanced around the room. She saw women laughing, working, and sharing stories, women who had once been as lost as she had been. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Let's do it." The grant application became a community effort, with everyone pitching in to write proposals, design a logo, and plan logistics. When they were approved months later, cheers erupted throughout the community center. Jonah's cooperative was on its way to becoming a full-fledged business. Davy's artistic ascent. Davy's life at the Academy of Visual Arts had taken a dramatic turn. His talent and unique perspective caught the attention of one of his professors, a celebrated artist who mentored promising students. Under his guidance, Davy honed his skills and began exhibiting his work in small galleries around the city. One of his pieces, South District Sunrise, depicted the transformation of his community through a vibrant blend of colors and textures. The painting garnered significant attention, earning Davy a feature in a prominent art magazine. As the accolades rolled in, Davy remained humble, always returning to the community center to teach younger children. He often said, "I started here. I'll never forget where I came from." One day, Antonio visited the academy to see Davy's latest work. The painting was a massive mural spanning an entire wall, a collage of faces from the South District. Jonah stitching fabric, Rosa teaching a workshop, children playing in the streets, and Antonio himself standing among them. "It's breathtaking," Antonio said, his voice filled with emotion. Davy turned to him, smiling. "It's our story." Antonio's new mission. Antonio's work in the South District had sparked something deeper within him. He had begun traveling to other underserved communities, sharing the lessons he had learned and helping implement similar initiatives. His approach combined empathy with strategy, ensuring that the changes were sustainable and community-driven. At a conference on social impact, Antonio stood before a packed audience of business leaders. Behind him, a screen displayed before and after images of the South District, juxtaposing its former state with its current vibrancy. "This," Antonio began, gesturing to the images, "is what happens when we prioritize people over profit. It's not just good ethics, it's good business. When communities thrive, we all thrive." The room erupted into applause, and Antonio felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for the countless people who had made the transformation possible. After the conference, Antonio was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as a social entrepreneur. "Your story inspired me," she said. "I've been trying to start something similar in my hometown, but I didn't know where to begin. What's the most important thing I should focus on?" Antonio thought for a moment before replying. "Listen. Before you act, listen to the people you want to help. They know what they need better than anyone." A homecoming celebration. A year after Davy's art competition victory, the South District held its first annual Festival of Hope. The celebration was a culmination of everything the community had achieved, from the cooperative's success to the thriving businesses and renovated homes. The streets were alive with music, food stalls, and performances. Davy had organized an art exhibit showcasing the work of local children, and Jonah's cooperative displayed their handcrafted clothing and accessories. Antonio arrived late, as he often did, slipping quietly into the crowd. But his presence didn't go unnoticed. People greeted him warmly, thanking him for his contributions. He waved it off with a smile, saying, "This is all you. I just helped where I could." As the evening wore on, a makeshift stage was set up for speeches. Rosa took the microphone first, delivering a heartfelt thank you to everyone who had contributed to the community's growth. Then, to Antonio's surprise, Jonah stepped onto the stage. "I'm not much of a public speaker," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But tonight, I feel like I need to say something. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here. Back then, my son and I were just trying to survive. But now, we're living." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. None of this would have been possible without the people in this community, and without one man who chose to see us, not as problems to solve, but as people with potential. Antonio Guerra, thank you for believing in us. The crowd erupted into applause as Antonio, clearly moved, stood and gave a small bow. Jonah stepped down from the stage, and as she passed him, she smiled. "You've changed our lives, Antonio." "You've changed mine too," he replied. Looking forward, as the festival wound down and the streets grew quieter, Antonio walked through the South District one last time. He passed the mural Davy had painted, now a beloved landmark, and the cooperative's workshop, its windows glowing warmly in the night. He paused in front of Jonah's shack, or what had been her shack. It had been replaced by a modest but sturdy house, built with funds from the cooperative's success. The sight filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. Antonio had built skyscrapers, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and amassed a fortune, but none of it had ever felt as meaningful as this. The South District was no longer a project to him. It was a part of his heart. And as he stood there, the distant laughter of children echoing in the air, he realized that this was the legacy he wanted to leave. A legacy of hope, resilience, and a world where everyone had a chance to thrive. He turned and walked away, ready to take the lessons of the South District to the next community in need, knowing that the bridges he had built here would stand for generations. A world beyond the South District. A full year after the first Festival of Hope, Antonio Guerra stood in his expansive office, staring at a map pinned to the wall. The map, once a simple tool for plotting his business ventures, was now marked with colorful pins representing the communities his company had helped transform. What began in the South District had evolved into a sweeping initiative across the country. Antonio's vision had grown beyond the confines of one neighborhood. He had established a foundation, aptly named Bridges of Hope, to formalize and expand his work. The foundation was a partnership between his company and other organizations, combining resources to bring sustainable change to struggling communities. It was no longer just Antonio's mission. It was a movement. Jonah's national spotlight. Jonah had become a symbol of resilience, though she often shrugged off the recognition. The cooperative she started in the South District had blossomed into a thriving business with a physical storefront and an online presence. The clothes, once made from donated fabric scraps, were now sought after for their unique designs and quality craftsmanship. One day, Jonah received a call that left her speechless. A prominent national magazine wanted to feature her story as part of a series on women who were redefining success in the face of adversity. When the journalist arrived, Jonah was hesitant. "I'm just a seamstress," she said, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. The journalist smiled. "You're more than that. You've turned a personal struggle into an opportunity for dozens of women. That's extraordinary." During the interview, Jonah spoke candidly about her journey, the struggles of raising Davy alone, and the pivotal role Antonio played in giving her the opportunity to rebuild her life. "Mr. Guerra didn't just hand us solutions," she explained. "He gave us the tools to build our own. That's the difference." The article, published with photos of Jonah at work and surrounded by the women of the cooperative, garnered national attention. Orders for their products poured in, and Jonah was invited to speak at conferences, sharing her insights on empowerment and community-driven change. But through it all, Jonah remained rooted in the South District, ensuring that the cooperative stayed true to its mission. Uplifting the community. Davy's global debut. Davy's journey had taken him far beyond the South District. At just 12 years old, he was invited to exhibit his artwork at an international children's art festival in Paris. His paintings, deeply rooted in the stories of his neighborhood, captivated audiences with their raw emotion and vibrant imagery. Antonio had been the first to suggest Davy submit his work for consideration. When the acceptance letter arrived, Davy ran straight to the community center, clutching the envelope and shouting, "I'm going to Paris." The community rallied around him, raising funds for the trip and celebrating as if the entire neighborhood were going with him. Antonio personally ensured that Davy and Jonah had everything they needed for their journey. In Paris, Davy's artwork stood alongside pieces from young artists around the world. His standout painting, "The Hands That Build," depicted the intertwined hands of South District residents. Jonah's strong, calloused hands stitching fabric, Antonio's steady hands holding a blueprint, and the delicate hands of children painting murals. The painting won the festival's grand prize, bringing international recognition to Davy's talent. But when asked about his success, Davy remained humble. "My art is about my home," he told reporters. "It's about the people who helped me become who I am." Upon returning to the South District, Davy was greeted by a hero's welcome. Children waved banners painted with his name, and the cooperative hosted a feast in his honor. For Davy, it was a reminder that no matter how far he went, his roots were firmly planted in the community that shaped him. Antonio's global vision. Antonio's Bridges of Hope Foundation continued to grow, partnering with governments, nonprofits, and corporations to replicate the success of the South District across the country. Each community had its unique challenges, but the core principle remained the same: listen, empower, and sustain. One of Antonio's most ambitious projects was in a struggling rural town that had been decimated by the closure of its main factory. Working closely with local leaders, Antonio's team transformed the abandoned factory into a vocational training center, teaching skills that aligned with the town's needs. The project created jobs, revitalized the economy, and gave the town a renewed sense of identity. But Antonio didn't stop there. He began pushing for systemic change, advocating for policies that prioritized affordable housing, equitable education, and access to health care. His speeches at international forums were passionate and direct, calling on leaders to rethink the relationship between business and community. "Profit doesn't have to come at the expense of people," he declared at a global summit. "The greatest return on investment is a thriving society." His words resonated, and his actions inspired other business leaders to follow suit. Slowly but surely, the idea of corporate responsibility evolved into corporate accountability. The South District legacy. The South District remained at the heart of everything Antonio did. Though his work had expanded, he returned often, walking the streets that had become unrecognizable from the days of crumbling shacks and despair. The Festival of Hope had become an annual tradition, drawing visitors from across the city to celebrate the achievements of the community. At the latest festival, Antonio was surprised to see his face on one of the murals, painted by Davy as a tribute to his contributions. "You made me look younger," Antonio joked, standing beside Davy as they admired the artwork. Davy grinned. "Consider it an artistic interpretation." During the festival's closing ceremony, Antonio was called to the stage. Jonah stood beside him, holding the microphone. "This festival exists because one man dared to believe in us," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Antonio Garrett didn't just give us hope. He taught us how to sustain it." Antonio stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion. "This community didn't just change my perspective, it changed my life. Everything we've achieved here was because of the strength and resilience of the people who call the South District home. And I promise you this, the work doesn't stop here. A future of endless possibilities." As the festival lights dimmed and the streets grew quiet, Antonio sat with Joanna and Davy outside her new home. They shared stories and laughter, the bond between them stronger than ever. "What's next for you?" Mr. Guerra?" Jonah asked, her tone teasing but curious. Antonio leaned back, gazing at the stars. "The same thing that's next for all of us. Keep building, keep learning, and keep hoping." Davy chimed in, his voice full of conviction. "I'm going to paint every story from the South District. The world needs to know what's possible." Jonah smiled, her heart full. "And I'm going to make sure every woman here knows what she's capable of." Antonio nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Then let's do it, together." In the end, the South District wasn't just a place on a map. It was a testament to the power of hope, the strength of community, and the enduring impact of one man's decision to care. As Antonio looked around, he knew the legacy they had built would last for generations. And for the first time, he felt truly fulfilled, not by what he had gained, but by what he had given. Expanding the horizon. 2 years after the Festival of Hope in the South District, the echoes of its success reverberated across the country and beyond. What had started as Antonio Guerra's personal mission to correct the course of his company had grown into a global movement. The Bridges of Hope Foundation was no longer just a symbol of change, but a practical force for transformation, addressing systemic issues in urban slums, rural towns, and disaster-stricken areas. Antonio found himself busier than ever, balancing the demands of his business empire with the growing reach of the foundation. Despite his packed schedule, he made it a point to stay connected to the South District. It wasn't just the birthplace of the initiative, it was his anchor. Jonah's leadership on the world stage. Jonah's transformation had become a story of international acclaim. Invitations to speak at conferences and seminars flooded her modest home, but she chose her appearances carefully, ensuring she stayed grounded in her work at the cooperative. The cooperative had expanded into a full-fledged social enterprise, employing dozens of women from neighboring districts. They crafted everything from clothing to home decor, blending traditional techniques with contemporary designs. Their products were now sold in high-end boutiques and online platforms across the country, providing financial stability for countless families. During a trip to London to speak at a summit on women's empowerment, Jonah shared her journey with a room full of influential leaders. "I'm not a businesswoman in the traditional sense," she began, her voice steady. "I'm a mother who needed to survive. But what I learned along the way is that survival isn't enough. We deserve to thrive. And when you empower one woman, you empower an entire community." Her speech brought the room to its feet, and afterward, she was approached by leaders who wanted to replicate her model in other parts of the world. Jonah agreed to mentor fledgling cooperatives, sharing the lessons she had learned and ensuring that her success became a blueprint for others. Back in the South District, Jonah remained the same humble, hard-working woman she had always been. She still taught sewing classes, still listened to the stories of her neighbors, and still reminded everyone that the South District's success was built by its people. Davy's global footprint. Davy, now 13, had become a rising star in the art world. His work, rooted in the struggles and triumphs of the South District, struck a chord with audiences everywhere. His pieces were celebrated for their authenticity, capturing the complexity of hope and resilience in vivid detail. Davy's first solo exhibition, titled Beyond the Canvas, was held in New York City. The gallery was packed with collectors, critics, and admirers. Among the featured works was a massive triptych titled The Three Pillars. One panel depicted Jonah sewing late into the night, her face lit by determination. The second showed Antonio standing amidst a group of South District children, blueprint in hand. And the third captured the vibrant murals of the community, painted by countless hands. The exhibition's proceeds went directly to the Bridges of Hope Foundation, a decision Davy made without hesitation. "Art should inspire action," he told reporters. "And this is my way of giving back." Despite his growing fame, Davy remained firmly connected to his roots. He continued to mentor young artists at the South District Community Center and often used his platform to highlight the stories of those still fighting for change. Antonio's global mission. Antonio's vision for Bridges of Hope had expanded into an ambitious international operation. The foundation now worked in over a dozen countries, addressing issues ranging from poverty and education to disaster recovery and climate resilience. Antonio believed that the lessons learned in the South District could be adapted to fit the unique needs of any community. One of the foundation's most impactful projects was in a coastal village devastated by a hurricane. Antonio's team partnered with local leaders to rebuild homes, establish a sustainable fishing industry, and create emergency shelters for future storms. The project not only restored the village, but also empowered its residents to prepare for and mitigate future challenges. During a visit to the village, Antonio spoke with a young fisherman who had just received his first boat through the initiative. "You've given us more than boats," the man said, shaking Antonio's hand. "You've given us a future." Antonio smiled. "A future you're building yourself. We're just here to support you." Back at headquarters, Antonio began working on a new idea: a global academy for community transformation. The academy would train leaders from underserved communities, equipping them with the skills and resources needed to drive sustainable change in their own regions. It was an ambitious project, but Antonio knew it was the logical next step: a reunion in the South District. Despite his international travels, Antonio always returned to the South District for the Festival of Hope. The festival had become a symbol of the community's resilience and progress, drawing visitors from far and wide. This year, the festival had grown larger than ever. The streets were lined with colorful banners, the air filled with music and the scent of food. Children darted between stalls, laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Antonio arrived early, walking through the bustling streets with a sense of pride and belonging. Joanna was at the cooperative's booth, showcasing their latest collection. She waved him over, her smile warm. Mr. Guerra, always the last to take credit, but the first to arrive. Antonio chuckled. Old habits die hard. As they talked, Davy appeared, holding a rolled-up canvas. "Mr. Antonio," he said, his face alight with excitement, "I made something for you." Antonio took the canvas, unrolling it carefully. It was a portrait of him standing in the South District, surrounded by the faces of the community. The expression on his painted face was one of quiet determination, a man whose heart was as full as his hands were busy. "This," Antonio's voice faltered as he looked at the painting. "This is incredible, Davy." "It's our thank you," Davy said simply, "for everything you've done." Antonio looked at Joanna, then at Davy, and finally at the bustling festival around them. "I should be thanking you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me more than I could ever give back." Looking ahead, as the sun set over the South District, casting the streets in a warm golden light, Antonio stood on the community center's rooftop, looking out over the neighborhood. He thought about how far they had all come: Joanna, Davy, Rosa, and everyone else who had poured their hearts into rebuilding this place. Antonio knew the journey wasn't over. There were still communities to reach, challenges to tackle, and lives to uplift. But for the first time, he felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a builder of bridges, a connector of people, and a believer in the boundless potential of hope. As he descended the rooftop stairs, the festival's music and laughter grew louder, welcoming him back into the fold. Antonio Guerra had built empires of steel and glass, but his greatest legacy was the one he had built in hearts and lives. The work would continue, and so would the hope.